Hi, everyone. So excited for this Advocacy 101, Abolition Advocacy. We're going to be focusing on what justice looks like beyond police, prisons, and punishment. And we are very honored to be joined by Healthy and Free Tennessee. Specifically, we have Brianna Perry, the Executive Director of Healthy and Free Tennessee. She was formerly the co-executive director for 5 years, but now the executive director. She graduated from Vanderbilt University with her BA in Sociology and Women's and Gender Studies in 2013. While a student, Brianna developed a passion for Black feminism and community organizing with a focus on reproductive freedom. For 2 years, Brianna taught English, science, and social studies in her hometown, Memphis. While teaching, she got involved in local organizing efforts around reproductive health, sexual assault awareness, and racial justice. Brianna went on to attend Peabody College at Vanderbilt University and completed her Master's of Education in Learning, Diversity, and Urban Studies in 2016. After returning to Nashville, she continued organizing around gender equity and racial justice issues and worked closely with the Nashville Feminist Collective and the Margaret Cunningham Women's Center at Vanderbilt. Yay! Welcome, Brianna. So excited to have you and have your wisdom and knowledge in here. And then Natalie Schilling, Policy and Advocacy Associate at Awake. I'm just excited to get started. Y'all know me, but I'm really happy to be here. So, a little outline of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with a grounding in values and your instincts around justice and safety. We're going to move on to framing abolition as both a vision and a strategy for change. Then we're going to think about context in repro, gender, and racial justice movements, really kind of the intersection of all three of those, and especially how we fit into those. And then thinking about the history of the carceral and legal system. Then looking at alternatives in practice. So, what does it actually look like to have alternatives to policing? And then some action of what you can do next, and a little plug of an amazing resource guide that Healthy and Free put together for us. So we're just going to dive in, and this is the last one of our summer training series. So I'm really excited to be closing us out for the summer. If you bought the pass, we appreciate you. So we're just going to dive right in. So I'm going to give a little bit of time for the people watching this, but you can just hit pause. But I want you to reflect on your values of justice and safety. So what does justice look like to you? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And what does safety mean to you? What does it mean to feel safe? What systems, what aspects of community is involved in safety for you? So I encourage you to pause and just spend a little bit of time thinking about that. And then thinking about how have your ideas of justice and safety been shaped by your life experience? So what have you been taught? What have you seen? What have you experienced that have helped shape these ideas of justice and safety? And then thinking about privilege, how has your privilege influenced your vision of justice and safety? How might that be different for someone with different life experience than you? And lastly, how have your views been shaped by carceral justice? So thinking of prisons and policing as the way to achieve justice and safety, how have your views been shaped by this carceral logic in your life? So I encourage you before you move on and watch the rest of this training to really reflect on that, journal about it, so that you can kind of enter the rest of this with an understanding of yourself, so you can go forward with an understanding of this big, huge idea of abolition. So moving on, we're going to just dive into the content. So framing abolition as both a vision and a strategy. So it's a vision for a world without prisons, policing, or legal punishment, and a strategy for dismantling carceral systems and building alternatives. And then, Brianna, I think you have a little bit more to talk about here.
Thank you, one, for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. It's definitely an important one and a timely one. And, happy to continue on to share a little more about what is abolition. And then, continuing on, how does it connect to reproductive justice work, gender justice work, gender justice work as well. As you just shared, Natalie, abolition is both a vision and a strategy. So, this vision for the world where everyone's needs are met and we are not responding to addressing harm, violence in punitive ways. And by extension of that, carceral logic or prisons, policing, surveillance, imprisonment, but instead a world where everyone's humanity is honored and we are working to hold people in caring ways. And it's also a strategy. Like, how do we get to that vision? What are the things that we need to do? And so you can think of abolition, or you'll hear of abolition as like this larger vision, this bigger vision that we're moving toward, and then also abolition strategy comes up. And so, just a few pieces of a quick background on abolition. Being a political vision strategy with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives, or as some abolitionists say, building new systems, new ways of being, new relationships, as well, new structures to really honor. Our full humanity. And so that definition comes from critical resistance, one of the earlier abolitionist organizations, and kind of this iteration of abolition that really rooted in right now comes out of the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so, with abolition work, we're trying to do away with what people talk about in the movement as the prison industrial complex. And so it's all of these components, police, prisons, courts as well, incarceration, electronic monitoring. And we're trying to get rid of all of those things and again, build new systems, new ways of being. And so abolitionists name themselves after, or we're following in this legacy of abolition work. Abolitionists doing this work during the, chattel slavery. And so something to point out, in critical resistance talks about this, and one of the resources that we highlight in the resource document, as abolitionists during chattel slavery were working to abolish slavery, they saw it as a system that could not be reformed. So it wasn't to like make some tweaks, and so, as such, that is how we see the prison industrial complex. It's not a system that can be reformed, it's working as it was designed. And so, we have to do away with it completely. And I know, Natalie, you'll talk later about what are non reformist reforms as we think about advocacy work. And something to hold. Um, as a way to ground us in this work, just like with chattel slavery, like it was done away with. And so it shows us that we can do away with this harmful system. Prisons didn't always exist. They're over 200 years old. And what we're seeing now, this massive prison expansion, really started in the 1970s. So that's something else to kind of really put this into context. Like, even though prison industrial complex, carceral logic is all around us, especially in the media, it's not something that always existed. And so, because of that, there was like a way of being together and navigating hard things. And we can think about that as a way to anchor ourselves as we build something new that really puts us in what unfolds in this time, place, and conditions that we're navigating. Let me go to the next slide. And so, a few other frameworks that I want to uplift that are connected to abolition, that are rooted in abolition. One being healing justice. And so, healing justice is a political strategy to intervene and respond to on generational trauma and systemic oppression, and build community and survival-led responses rooted in Southern traditions of resiliency to sustain our emotional, physical, spiritual, psychic, and environmental well-being. And so that is from Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, which is the group that's credited with like offering healing justice as this framework and vision and also a strategy as well. And so healing justice often comes up in different spaces today, but really wanting to uplift it as a vision, but also it is this strategy. And as we think about the policing and imprisonment and surveillance that people are navigating, communities are navigating, especially communities of color, there needs to be like healing that happens, healing from that harmful system and being incarcerated and experiencing incarceration and surveillance. And when we think about harm and violence that happens by nature of some of it is just harm happening just as human beings, and we know we live in a violent system in a violent society in the US. And so how can we really get at the roots of harm and violence and really think about healing, especially generational healing as well? So again, because of the impact of incarceration and policing, wanting to think about healing from that, and then also healing for communities who've been disproportionately impacted by systems of oppression. And so that's deeply connected to abolition. In the last framework that I wanted to uplift, and thank you for going to the next slide, is transformative justice. So, transformative justice is actually an abolitionist framework, it's an approach, it's also a strategy, and is seeking safety and accountability without relying on alienation, punishment, incarceration, state or systemic violence. And that comes from Generation Five, a transformative justice group. And so, similar or in the same vein as healing justice, transformative justice is seeking to support healing and healing across the board for survivors, for people who've caused harm, larger community healing, and how that's deeply connected to accountability to really support this holistic well being without turning to existing punishment systems. And so, a big question that transformative justice holds up, and again, how this is like connected to healing justice, is what are the conditions that allow for harm, of violence to take place, and how can we really uproot what's at the system, like the root system, in order to shift those conditions. And there's a lot of focus on prevention work, and also thinking about how everyone is cared for, and again, safety and accountability for the people who were harmed, the person who was harmed, the people or the person who perpetuated the harm, in a larger community that's prioritized. And it's yeah, just really recognizing that at the root of harm and violence are harmful systems of oppression, and how do we work to transform those conditions and not rely on these systems that are inhumane, that are carceral. Hmm. Now moving into like how does this connect to reproductive justice, racial justice, and gender justice overall, because that's the work that Healthy and Free is doing, and also Awake. And something to uplift before I get into like some key examples of flashpoints during history is that when it comes to responding to gender-based violence, communities, especially communities of color, like during the 60s and 70s, as we think about Jim Crow and navigating other systems that were impacting Black communities, regardless of region, and how the police wasn't a source of support. Like the police couldn't be relied on. We saw how the police acted during the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and so these women of color, especially in these communities, when harm happened, domestic violence, sexual violence, they did not turn to the police. They built out systems of support, sources of care within their communities. And so, just to say, kind of like the foundations that we then see. kind of continuing on throughout decades in the late 90s, early 2000s, and abolition language really building. It really connects back to where, there's this longer lineage, of course, especially thinking about indigenous communities as well. And I know, Natalie, you'll get into some of how like this is like policing has built over time. But just to say that like to uplift how abolition has been deeply connected to racial justice, reproductive justice, and gender justice because these women of color, these people of color who are experiencing gender-based violence were not relying on imprisonment. They were not relying on policing or surveillance to navigate what was happening inside of their communities, their households. And so just to say that this is important to uplift as a deep connection there. And so just some things going back a little bit, the first women's prison that opened in the United States opened during the late 1800s. And there was so much gynecological experimentation that was happening inside of that prison, but also other women's prisons in the US. And just the reasons why women were incarcerated, some reasons included being sexually deviant. And what does that mean? If people weren't married or they weren't seen as these docile like mothers and wives, and if they went against that then they could come into contact with jails. And so that's like something to uplift, and again just like what was happening there when it comes to gender and contact with police and prisons, and with the gynecological abuse and sexual abuse before like IRB and a lot of regulations related to testing and subject. There was a lot that happened when it came to marginalized groups of people, people on the margins, and people who are incarcerated continue to be on the margins. And that was true when these first women's prisons opened. And so Dr. Theo Parvin, and he is one of the founding fathers of gynecology and obstetrics, and he was once the president of the American Medical Association. He so-called was working for the first women's prison, and that prison is the Indiana Reformatory for Women and Girls. And he did so much experimentation, was perfecting different surgeries on these incarcerated women. The concept of choice and consent was not present. They were confined to a cell, and doctors such as Dr. Parvin came in and sexually assaulted these women, violated these women to perfect surgeries on like ovaries and other things related to um, gynecology. And so that was very much so rampant. And we also know that gynecological experimentation happened during chattel slavery, but just to say, just these examples of when there wasn't consent and how that happened within jails and prisons. And something else with this deep connection between abolition and racial justice, reproductive justice, and gender justice, because wanted to uplift like these women who were on the margins, these women of color, these poor women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by incarceration. And that very much so was the case during the late 1800s. But fast forwarding it a little bit into like the late 20th century, well, definitely moving into the 21st century, this criminalization of pregnancy outcomes that continues to happen, especially thinking about the uptick since the end of Roe v. Wade. And so bringing it home to Tennessee, in 2014, Tennessee became the first state and remains the only state that criminalized certain substances during pregnancy. And this law did sunset in 2016, but the logic behind it is still important to uplift. And there are examples since 2016 of Tennessee legislators trying to introduce legislation to criminalize pregnancy outcomes. And so so we see that happening with substance use during pregnancy. We see that happening with self-managed abortions, and also pregnant people experiencing miscarriages. There have been examples over the past few years in places like Colorado, in the Midwest as well, on the East Coast, of people experiencing miscarriages and them facing like manslaughter charges. And so, just to say that's like another piece around this, or it being connected to this carceral logic. If you are not this particular parent, or you don't experience pregnancy in this way, then you need to be criminalized. You need to be surveilled, and this disproportionately impacts Black women, Black pregnant people, indigenous pregnant people, women of color who are working class, poor women. So again, just like how this is a racial justice issue, reproductive justice issue, gender justice, and how it connects to abolition. And lastly, wanted to uplift just some statistics when it comes to communities of color being disproportionately impacted by policing and surveillance a little more. And also, when we talk about policing and surveillance, we are thinking about the family policing system, also known as the child welfare system, and how that system surveils parents, especially parents of color, and really trying to make a decision. The state is like who gets to be a parent, who shouldn't be a parent, and how that's based on white supremacist logic and how that connects with carceral logic. So Black people are disproportionately impacted by incarceration. Some new statistics that have come out in recent years show that 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001, and my brother was born in 2001. And so that really, like hits home for me. So 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 is likely to be in prison at some point in his lifetime. Indigenous people's incarceration rate is double the national rate. So Indigenous people's incarceration rate, 763 per 100,000, and the national incarceration rate is 350 per 100,000. 53% of Black children will experience Child Protective Services contact by the age of 1980, by the age of 18. Sorry, I'm thinking about another statistic. So 53% of Black children will experience some type of contact with Child Protective Services, DCS, Department of Children's Services, by age 18. And with that contact, lots of Black children are separated from their families, off of very like racist ways of thinking about parenting. And lastly, and going back to women's incarceration and the reasons women were incarcerated, but just women's incarceration overall, since 1980, women's incarceration has steadily risen. And some research shows by upwards of 700%. And so, I wanted to just share some things related to like what's happening when it comes to the intersections of incarceration, policing, uh, racism, reproductive oppression, gender-based violence, and how these things are converging. And it paints a picture of like who's disproportionately impacted by policing, surveillance, and criminalization, and what's happening to them, and why we shouldn't rely on these systems, and they aren't meeting like people like with care, and they're actually doing the opposite and creating more harm and more violence, and disproportionately impacting communities who are already on the margins. And I'll pass it back to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for all of that. I hope everyone who watches is like soaking it all up because I think so much knowledge in there and just thinking a lot about how these systems have started to abuse people of color, women, marginalized groups, and continue to. So thinking about along those lines, the historical roots of the criminal legal system. So where did we start and how does that continue? I feel like it's been pass along on Instagram a little bit, but of the like origins of policing. But if you haven't heard about it, we'll talk a little bit about it, but there's a lot more to dive into. But the original police were slave patrols. And they were created with the specific intent of maintaining control over slave populations and returning escaping enslaved people back to plantation owners. So this was the first version of the police, was created entirely to own Black bodies and return them to their owners. So obviously extremely problematic, deeply troubling that that is our first example of police. And part of the system of systemic thinking of abolition is when the systems were built to uphold white bodies, to police and harm Black bodies, that can't be reformed. It must be torn down and started new. So just thinking about those slave patrols as the first police. And then after slave patrols and after slavery, we saw the enactment of the Black Codes, which were a system of policies, particularly in the South, built to restrict the freedoms of newly freed Black people, and criminalize men who were out of work or who were not working at a job whites recognized. So just criminalizing just existing while being a Black person in America. So then all of this swath of newly freed Black people were swept into this prison industrial complex that was starting. And then we see another origin of policing is in 1845 when New York City created the first professional police force, like as we see today, these professional police forces that were modeled after the slave patrols in the South. So they used the blueprint of slave patrols to create professional police that we now see swept across the nation. And soon after New York City, we saw St. Louis, Chicago, and LA follow. And then obviously has spread across the nation. So just thinking about the impact of policing today, how it's no wonder that we have the impacts we do when it was modeled after literal slave patrols, and then in the Black codes, literally just criminalizing Black people existing that were newly freed. So kind of launching off of that, thinking about incarceration. So once we have these police sweeping these folks up into these jails and prisons, we see in 1865 with the 13th Amendment did outlaw slavery with a huge except as a punishment for a crime. So it left this huge loophole open that yes, slavery is prohibited unless you are incarcerated. So obviously we saw this huge wave of, okay, well, we want to keep having slavery in the South. So how can we make that still happen? Oh, by putting all of these crimes and using this as a punishment for crime. So we see that in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. And soon after 1865, we see in the 1870s this large development of prison farms and convict leasing. So after this exception was in place, Southern states quickly created these prison farms, which were basically just slavery in an evolved form, and convict leasing, where employers got to bid on leased, overwhelmingly Black incarcerated workers. So slavery in a slightly different format, where they were then subjected to brutal conditions, often worked to death. So this was happening in the 1870s all the way up until 1928, where we see chain gangs replace this system of convict leasing. And chain gangs forced incarcerated people to labor at tasks such as road construction, ditch digging, or farming while literally chained together. Chain gangs minimized the cost of guarding prisoners by exposing these prisoners to painful ulcers and dangerous infections from the heavy shackles around their wrists and ankles. And also another complication of having these chain gangs was if one individual missteps or falls, it could imperil an entire group of people who were chained together. And it prevented these chained individuals from moving away from if someone misstep or fall or an aggressive or violent prisoner. So this new system was incredibly harmful, just an evolved form of slavery. And we also see most of the literal ground we walk on, the roads we walk on, the trains we ride, built by enslaved, incarcerated people. So literally the ground we walk on was made with blood. So just thinking about incarceration, its history, and the way that it was basically just an evolved way to still allow slavery, we can understand why this is a system that can't just be reformed to be better when it was entirely built for a purpose that is nefarious. So, thinking about that and now how we see this show up in modern iterations. Policing and incarceration had existed obviously since like the 1800s and the 13th Amendment and beyond. But we really saw the explosion of mass incarceration with the war on drugs and Nixon. And so if you haven't heard this quote, prepare yourself, because the first time I heard it, I wanted to scream and cry and throw things. But Nixon's aide was quoted from saying, "We know we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war, the Vietnam War, or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So thinking about the entire purpose of this war on drugs that partially led to this huge rise in mass incarceration was to break up Black communities, to break up anti-war communities, and associating Black individuals with heroin and thus criminalization. So we saw massive impacts of that and mass incarceration. Then also thinking about the impacts of family policing. Brianna kind of touched on it quite a bit, but also just thinking about the disproportionate impacts of family policing. I'm a social worker. I was deeply entrenched in the DCS is meant to help people ideology. But what we really see, even though the standard is supposed to be keeping families together, we've seen that heavily abused all throughout the history of especially white social workers doing a very poor job of keeping families together and especially breaking families apart that were marginalized and people of color. And so family policing is its own form of criminalization. And we see, obviously, when these families are separated, a lot of times the parents are subject to incarceration. So we just see this modern iteration of the criminal legal system of separating families like in chattel slavery, but instead with people with clipboards walking through houses. Then also thinking about the school to prison pipeline, especially in Tennessee, we've seen this rise of school resource officers putting these officers directly in the schools as a measure of safety. But we are constantly having these individuals who are already likely had negative experiences with police, and now we're putting them inside the schools. And we see this special targeting of Black men or Black boys specifically in schools, but also Black women, and how schools are abusing these school resource officers. And we also see these zero tolerance policies that rose up, especially in the 2000s, that were disproportionately suspending, expelling Black students. And then from the suspension, expulsion, that easy path slide right down to incarceration. And this huge mass incarceration impacting Black men and women. So that's a huge modern iteration of the criminal legal system at work. We're starting from school. We're showing them, here are these officers, get used to these officers, and then sending them down the pipeline. And then thinking about ICE, especially recently, having these masked up individuals terrorizing communities, separating families, and in the vein of safety and keeping our neighborhoods safe, but really causing deep, deep harm in our communities. Also, the criminalization of homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness. While we know the science behind substance abuse and mental illness is that these are things that should be treated as public health and mental health crises that need to be treated with care and treatment. Instead, we've seen it treated as criminal acts. And instead of getting these folks the help that they need, getting them housing and support, shoving them into jails that are inadequate, to say the least, to treat substance abuse, mental health, and then spitting them out after incarceration with no resources and far worse off than they even were to begin with. In this modern iteration of the criminal legal system, shoving these folks that society deems as not worth the time, not worth the resources into prisons. And And then lastly, Brianna talked about this as well, but thinking about abortion bans and pregnancy criminalization, seeing women terrified to carry babies with the fear of their pregnancy outcome being criminalized and then being blamed for miscarriage, for if they have a late term complication, what's going to happen? Will they be denied care? We've seen this huge uptick, especially with the fall of Roe and the Dobbs decision, sweeping criminalization of pregnancy outcomes. And we can feel that in our communities and in our bodies. So these are just all evolved forms of why the criminal legal system enacts harm and perpetuates harm, and aren't easy fixes to just say, oh well, if we just tweak this, or if we tell the CPS officers to do this, or if we have really nice school resource officers, it'll be better. Well, really, all of them are operating on flip sides of the same coin of chattel slavery. So, really fun stuff, but we're going to shift into the more hopeful, exciting stuff. But is there anything, Brianna, you wanted to add with this historical roots conversation?
No, you covered it.
Okay, perfect. All right. So now that we've kind of covered a little bit, there's a lot more, but about the harms of the criminal legal system. So, what does it actually look like to have safety and justice beyond this punishment system that we have right now of policing and the courts and CPS and criminalizing reproductive justice? What does actual safety and justice look like if we don't have that? Because I know that's something that feels really huge and scary of, okay, well, we got rid of all this overnight, it would be what would we even do? And so just wanted to give you guys some like bite-sized pieces of what this looks like, what community and safety can look like beyond punishment. And so the four big buckets we're going to talk about are community-based crisis response, funding and investment over incarceration, restorative justice and accountability, and then reproductive justice and healing justice frameworks. So, and how we're going to do it is just kind of do little vignettes or little case studies that are examples of these things actually being done already, and the success that they're already seeing on the small scale. And we can envision what they would look like on a massive scale with more resources. So thinking about community-based crisis response. A great example of this is Cahoots. So this is a community-based crisis response team that was created in Eugene, Oregon. And they are a team of one medic, nurse, paramedic, or EMT, and a mental health crisis worker. So whether that's like a social worker, psychiatrist, psychologist. So they are like this two-person team of crisis intervention. And the way that Cahoots does it is they take about 17% of 911 calls, could be more if they got more resources, but they divert quite a few calls from the police, and instead they go and respond to a crisis. And the important part about Cahoots that I want to emphasize is that they do not respond alongside a police officer. So they do not bring a police officer with them, and police don't also respond to the scene. It is just the mental health worker and the physical health worker. And that's a really important aspect because we've seen kind of similar programs happen, especially after the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement of let's just put a social worker in the car with the police officer. And instead, we know that isn't what we're looking for. That still elevates the scene. It has that extra layer of danger, and that's still a reliance on police to treat people that don't need the police there. And so the Cahoots team are there. They're unarmed, but fully trained in de-escalation. And they're committed to all nonviolent resolutions of any conflicts. So they're there really to take the scene, to de-escalate it, and treat whatever physical or mental health needs that are present and connect to some resources after. So they've seen incredible success. I read one article that said you're hard pressed to find someone that doesn't have good things to say about Cahoots. They overwhelmingly respond to people with homelessness, dealing with homelessness, substance abuse, mental health crises, and they're able to give the care that's needed in the moment and help de-escalate and connect them to later services. So a really cool way of using a crisis response team. So there's still someone going to the scene, treating needs, but it's not escalated by a police officer, and it's actually treated as the emergency that it needs with different resources. Nashville has a version of this called Community and Care, but it sends a mental health professional alongside an officer in responding to crisis calls. So definitely some room for advocacy there of what if we shifted to a different model, similar to Cahoots? Could be a fun thing to advocate for if you're feeling passionate about that. So that is a community-based crisis response example. And then kind of shifting over to the funding and investment over incarceration. Really what this means is if we devoted even some or all the resources that we devote to upkeep and building of prisons and detention centers and police stations and all of these things, if we invested that money directly into the communities that are most impacted by the criminal legal system and what you may have heard of like at-risk youth, of people that are living in communities where the most violence is occurring. If we spent that money investing in their communities, giving them resources, making sure they have food, housing, safety, shelter, mentors, all of these good schools, hospitals, all of these things, what that does for instead of these retroactive incarceration punishment systems. And so we've seen an incredible version of this in Baltimore under Mayor Brandon Scott, who decided to treat violent crime and gun violence as a public health emergency by treating the root causes of violence, which were racism and poverty. So they developed this Safe Streets program with a vast investment in job training, education, relocation services, and matching individuals most at risk of committing violence with life coaches and mentors. And so the result of these like incredible investment in communities is that Baltimore has seen a 22% drop in homicides, a 19% drop in non-fatal shootings, and a 71% reduction in juvenile homicide victims, which is a 50-year low for Baltimore. Because they've tried the over policing, they've tried the mass incarceration, and nothing has seen results like this, of this humongous drop in shootings and violent crime. And so a quote directly from Mayor Scott is, "It takes investments beyond the police department, including in resources like rec centers, parks, pools, and schools to build healthy, resilient communities that nurture healthy, resilient people." So it's just a beautiful model of what beautiful things can happen when we really spend the money, spend the resources directly in the communities that need it, and how much beauty and mentorship can happen when just the right people are empowered to help their community. So that's one example. And we do have a similar example here in Nashville, which is exciting. The Black Nashville Assembly's varsity spending plan asked the Nashville Metro Council for a $10 million investment in young people, families, and neighborhoods in Nashville to build safer communities and address gun violence. And so they asked for that $10 million investment, with $4 million for community-centered programming at community centers, for restorative justice programming, and the Office of Youth Safety that would be responsible for implementing and managing high school community centers and community-based restorative justice pilot programs to address gun violence and prevent harm and foster safe communities. So the Office of Youth Safety really is the first of its kind. There's this new director, and they have a commitment to not rely on courts or police for this safety. And so they did end up securing $1.7 million from the council, but they're continuing their advocacy for the full investment in the future. But if this sounds interesting to you, please go follow the Black Nashville Assembly. They have a whole tab on their website about the varsity spending plan. And it's a really cool thing that we get to shout out here in Nashville. So we'll definitely be having our eyes on that. But a great example of funding and investment over incarceration. Moving into restorative justice. So if you haven't ever heard of restorative justice, it's an approach to accountability and healing in which those harmed by a crime or conflict and those responsible for the harm come together in facilitated conversation, which those affected by a particular incident play a part in repairing the harm and finding a way forward in healing for both parties. So Rafa Institute here in Nashville focuses specifically on juvenile offenses and using restorative justice to help these juvenile offenders. How they do it is that cases are referred to them from the juvenile court, and the parties agree to go into this process of restorative justice. And once they do agree, they work with them separately. So working with the person harmed and the person who did the harm in a highly supported and committed relationship with a restorative justice facilitator, as they seek to understand what has happened, what led to it. And for the person harmed involves physical, mental, social, and spiritual needs assessments, um, and really help them understand the harm that they caused and what healing and repair could look like, and encouraging them to take accountability and truly understand what happened and how to repair it, and commitment to never do it again. So this beautiful conversations that are happening, really repairing harm, figuring out what is the root cause of this, what led you to cause this harm, whether that's I didn't have food, so I robbed this store, and they are having to take accountability. Okay, when I did that to meet my need, what came from that harm? And so it's a really, really promising. It has really great results for them. And so we just see that especially their impacts on recidivism are incredible. So that's the repeat offenders, people that commit an offense and then eventually commit a different offense and end back into incarceration, showing between 10 and 25% reduction in recidivism compared to current criminal legal practice. So thinking about if this were to be enacted at a wider scale, on a bigger scale, with more investment, more transform or restorative justice facilitators, really what could happen, what healing could occur for all people, the lack of repeat offenders really shows like the promise of this practice and how it could be a really beautiful system if it were invested in. All right, passing it back to Brianna for some transformative justice.
Thank you, Natalie. And one thing I want to uplift before I get into transformative justice and a case study from Tennessee. With the funding and investment over incarceration, you might also hear this as invest, divest. And so that framing very much so became even more popularized during the 2020 racial justice uprisings. And so just to say that is the same thing. So if you hear invest divest, we need to like really push invest divest. That's divesting from carceral systems, policing, courts. Prisons and investing in life affirming institutions, resources that meet people's material needs and holistic well being. So, libraries, public schools, things of that nature, parks. And so, just wanted to say that. And yeah, Black National Assembly is an organization in Nashville who's doing Invest Divest work. And there are definitely other organizations, including nationally. So just wanted to say that really quickly. So transformative justice, and I spoke about this at the beginning. It's a framework of an approach that's rooted in abolition. So how to resolve, how to navigate, how to move through instances of harm and violence without relying on the prison industrial complex, the courts, policing, and prisons, and how to center safety, healing, and accountability for all who are involved. So, safety for the survivor, accountability for the person who perpetuated the harm or instance of violence, but also healing for them, and then community healing and transformation as well. And so, Healthy and Free Tennessee, along with, in collaboration with the official Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter, um, enter into a partnership or started this partnership with Mia Mingus. And Mia Mingus is a national transform justice facilitator. She used to be connected to the Bay Area Transform Justice Collective, and they the biggest piece of their work was supporting families with navigating childhood sexual abuse and young people who experience childhood sexual abuse. And so she also does disability justice work as well. So we partnered with Mia Mingus to host a statewide transformative justice uh, training, and it was an intensive to really become more familiar with, have a deeper grounding in transformative justice principles and values. And from that, we dug a little deeper. We launched first Transformative Justice 201 cohort in 2022, and that was a 3-year process, a 3-year cohort to train up people, organizers, activists, community members in transformative justice process facilitation. And so when harm happens in communities, there's this question often like, okay, what do we do? You know, if we are not going to turn to the police who are supposed to help, and you know, really they don't, but that's like what has been pushed as the a source of safety for so long. It's like, what do systems look like that can be built in communities and really to expand what's already been happening in communities for so long. And so we see transformative justice collectives, such as the one that we've been building out as is a good pathway. It's a good new way of being in order to intervene and also do some prevention work as well. And we want people to be able to reasonably support their communities with navigating instances of harm and violence. So if it's, you know, neighborhood we're talking about, or even a movement group, we know there have been lots of ruptures that have happened in movement organizations because of harm and violence. And it's like, how can we um, respond in a different way? How can we ensure care is infused, regardless of it's the person who is surviving the instance of harm or violence, the larger community, and the person who's perpetuating or perpetrating the instance of harm and violence. And so we want people to be skilled up and to really be able to tap into that practice of holding space for others and journeying alongside them. And so that really was the focus of this cohort. And so we wrapped it up last year and now have launched the Transform Tennessee, Transformer Justice Collective, Tennessee Raising Accountable and New Systems for Our Radical Movements. That's what Transform stands for. And very much so, I want to encourage people to check out Healthy and Free's website to learn more about the collective. And we also have a forum if you or someone else is navigating instance of harm. Again, it could be within a group, it could be within how you define community, neighborhood. Another space, we do encourage you to complete that form and we'll, you know, see how we can support. But we also have resources on our website more about transformative justice, and we'll be sharing some resources too to read more about transformative justice and how that is a viable option for folks to turn to and build out in their communities. And lastly, just how reproductive justice, healing justice, transformative justice, how these frameworks really connect and come together. One question that is really the through line among the three frameworks is related to what are the resources that communities need in order to live in safe, healthy, and thriving communities. That's really at the heart of it. Because when we think about safety, when we think about when we think about communities really being able to thrive, that gets at reproductive justice, healing justice, and transformative justice. So with the next slides, these are some of the things, you know, housing, schools, access to nutrition, to nutritious foods, access to green space, access to contraception, and that goes into the reproductive justice framework: the human right to have a child, the human right not to have a child, the human right to raise children in safe, thriving communities, whole communities, and the human right to bodily autonomy, free from all forms of oppression. And so that's really at the heart of abolition. That's what we're building toward, and at the heart of reproductive justice and transformative justice as well. So yes, I already just shared that like really what we're trying to build toward is communities to be self-determined and be able to live and thrive in communities where our holistic needs are being met.
Mm,
It's at the heart of these frameworks.
yes, amazing. All right. So now that you're fully transformed into an abolitionist, just kidding, it's probably going to be a process and lots of questioning, but if you're kind of ready to move on to that taking action, okay, I'm sold, let's do it. Just want to kind of ground you in how you can not do more harm by thinking about harm reduction versus actual abolitionist policy. And so this central question here is how do we reduce the scale and scope of the criminal legal system? So when you're supporting a policy, thinking about does this reduce the scale and scope of the criminal legal system? I just want to note here that doesn't mean that we can't help the people currently incarcerated. We definitely want to still be helping the people currently incarcerated, people newly exiting prisons. We want to still be doing all of that helpful harm reduction stuff in the current prisons. But in thinking about reformist policies, we're thinking about what's really reducing the scale and scope of the criminal legal system. And so the full critical resistance where this came from should be on the resource page. But this is just kind of like narrowing it down. So when you're thinking about a reform that you're evaluating whether you want to support it, these are some important questions to ask yourself before you step forward and actually support it. Does this reduce the number of people imprisoned, under surveillance, or other forms of state control? Does it reduce the reach of jails, prisons, and surveillance in our everyday lives? Does it create resources and infrastructures that are steady, preventative, and accessible without police and prison guard contact? And does it strengthen capacities to prevent or address harm and create processes for community accountability? So this is just a really great place to start. And I really encourage you to check out the full page because it really breaks down a couple examples of maybe it's building a new swanky detention facility for minors. It might sound really awesome and help make people that are going through the system feel a little less in danger. But really, when we start to ask these questions, no, it's not reducing the number of people in prisons. No, it's actually increasing the reach of jails. It's not really creating any resources. So, really, like going through thinking about even if something looks good on the surface, going in and asking these more tough questions before you support something. But of course, there is things we can be doing in the meantime before we, rip all the systems down. And these are ways to like chip away and start to really take away and replace with these beautiful alternatives that we talked about. So big one is repealing carceral laws. So wherever we can, repealing these highly carceral punitive laws. So whether that's criminal abortion bans, drug offenses, nonviolent drug offenses, whether that's getting rid of cash bail, like a lot of states have moved towards, just finding any possible areas we can to start chipping away at these carceral laws and advocating for investment, advocating for instead of building this new detention facility, what if we invested in a restorative justice community center, thinking about these kind of things. And advocating for care-based infrastructure. So how can we advocate for when maybe there's an option to either support a criminal legal system solution? Can we instead invest in a housing solution, a health solution, a childcare, care-based infrastructure? How do these things impact our communities? And how can we invest in these instead of something that criminalizes and polices our communities? And then these are a big one, but eliminating mandatory minimum sentencing. That was a huge rise during the mass incarceration rise during the 70s and beyond, of having these mandatory minimum sentences that didn't allow judges to really consider different factors. This is a huge contribution to mass incarceration and would be a great thing to get rid of wherever we can. And then really importantly, the death penalty. If you are someone that's either on the fence thinking about it, we do have a full death penalty 101 that's up on our YouTube. So highly encourage you to look at that and just think about the socioeconomic racial impacts of the death penalty and the way that that system is not fair and often executes innocent people. So if we can eliminate mandatory minimum sentences, death penalty, all of these huge parts of the criminal legal system that are causing especial harm while we work towards getting rid of the whole system as a whole. So these are just some examples, not even close to an exhaustive list, but just some ideas about how you can work towards it, because it's not going to happen overnight. And abolitionist thinkers don't know it's not going to happen overnight, but it's part of chipping away until we can get rid of the whole thing. And then coalition building is really important. So if you are ready to enter these spaces of abolitionist reform and or complete abolition, how do you show up in alignment with values of abolitionists and organizations? So you need to be entering into these spaces as going through the processes of questioning and learning and listening more than anything. And you want to step into advocacy, not stepping over the most impacted, but stepping up and listening to the most impacted and to those closest to the issues, really amplifying their voices, amplifying those most impacted by the criminal legal system instead of grabbing the microphone and saying, well, I believe in this, really listening to the people most impacted and uplifting their voices. And then importantly, working across movements. We know that it impacts reproductive justice. We know people with disabilities are heavily targeted by the criminal legal system, and obviously working with anti-racism and gender justice, all of these things. We are much stronger together than we are apart. So if we can work across movements, join across in coalition to advocate for these things, we're going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more effective. It's just some important things there. And then if you want to start getting into those coalitions, these are just some examples of abolitionist organizations here in Tennessee that you can support, as well as, of course, Healthy and Free Tennessee and Wake, we're working on it. So yeah, definitely please follow these local orgs. And then Brianna is we're going to send a resource document in the follow-up email with all these different opportunities for you to look more into this. But yeah, Brianna, just want to give you some space to advocate for anything for Healthy and Free. I know you've got some upcoming training series, and yeah, just giving you the rest of the space.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Yeah, I would just encourage people to check out our Instagram. We've been doing this In Bloom political education series throughout this summer, and so some of the resources that we need investment, such as childcare, public benefits, what you name, Natalie. We have taken a deeper dive into those topics, and yeah, just encourage people to check out upcoming conversations, and that's listed on our website. And again, if you're interested in the Transformative Justice Collective, you can also look at our website for more information. Thank you.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much. As always, y'all can look at Awakes or our website and our Instagram if you want to support us further. Our Advocate Society, if you sign up before the end of August, we have a gift card raffle going on. So if you want to support Awake and get some gift cards in return, please do that. But thank you so much.